I want you to imagine that you go to the nearest town or village and conduct an informal survey. And you go up to the people passing by and you ask them one simple question, and that is this: why did Jesus die? Why did Jesus die? I think the answers you would receive would be dependent upon whether or not a person was a Christian or whether or not a person had experience in the church or going to a Christian-based school. Those who had none of this experience, probably the best they could come up with would be responding, I hear that Jesus died on the cross. Now that doesn't answer the question. The question is not, how did Jesus die? But why did Jesus die? Those who are coming from a Christian perspective would answer, I would say almost instinctively, well, Jesus died to save us from our sins. Now this response is correct. It's biblically informed. It's theological in nature. However, consider Pontius Pilate when he handed Jesus over to be crucified. Do you think he was thinking theologically? Do you think he was reckoning, you know what, if Jesus is crucified here, he'll pay for the sins of the world? We don't have any evidence that he was thinking that way. I think if we were to ask people this question, why did Jesus die? I think the responses can be divided into two categories. And I'm grateful for the New Testament scholar John Drain for these two categories. One is looking at it theologically. Jesus Christ died to save the world. He died to pay our sins, or Jesus gave his life as a ransom for many. These are theological responses. But then there are also historical responses as well that help us answer the question how Jesus went from one moment teaching to the next being crucified on a cross. In this video, I want to focus on the historical reasons as to how Jesus ended up being crucified. Why is this important? Because our faith is a historically based faith. And the theological responses are very, very important, but I don't think we should lose sight of the historical reasons as well. Let's get started. Before we undertake this journey in seeking to answer the question, why did Jesus die? I want to hasten to add that I in no way want to minimize the various theological reasons for the death of Jesus given in the New Testament. I just want to focus on the historical events leading up to the death of Jesus, events that I believe explain why he was crucified from a historical perspective. But both the historical and the theological perspectives are critical. One could even argue you can't have one without the other. But again, I'm just choosing to focus on the historical side of things. And I want to begin first with a historian who was a contemporary of Jesus Christ, a Jewish historian by the name of Flavius Josephus. He died after Jesus, but wrote a tiny bit about Jesus in his 18th book on the antiquities of the Jews in chapter 3, section 3. I'm only going to read the first half of this tiny section so that you will see that there is consistency between what Josephus has written about Jesus Christ and the portrait we receive from the four Gospels. Josephus writes, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man,
for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. So we can see that, how did Jesus live his life? He was a worker of wondrous works. Okay, so he was a miracle worker, but he was also a teacher. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. Now he's going to get around to explaining why Jesus was killed. He was Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross. I'll stop there. So, Josephus is saying the reason why Jesus was crucified is because you had, he calls them principal men, but men of authority, men of influence, respected men in Jerusalem. They suggested to Pilate, who was the Roman leader in Jerusalem, they suggested that Jesus be crucified. And Pilate ultimately went along with their suggestion. That is why, from Josephus' perspective, that Jesus was killed.
Now a new question emerges. Why would these principal men, these men of influence, want to see Jesus dead? I'm going to answer that question. But first, let's go back to Mark chapter 1. Early on in Jesus' public ministry, he's not even on the radar of the leading men of society. But we're going to see that just because of his greatness, he's going to be a challenge to these men in authority. Now, Jesus has just finished recruiting some disciples. So in Mark chapter 1, verse 21, they, that is Jesus and the disciples, went into Capernaum. And immediately on the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and began to teach. Now, those who were just going off what they know about Jesus from Josephus, they wouldn't be surprised. Well, this is what this guy did. He was a teacher. So we're finding Jesus teaching. They were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Now, the scribes were part of these leading principal men in Israel, in Israel's society. They were the teachers of the law. They were the most educated individuals. It was their job to teach the law and to interpret it. Okay? Again, these are the PhDs of society. And when Jesus begins to teach, he has authority that people don't experience with these scribes. Now imagine this for a moment. Imagine a senior pastor ends up recruiting and hiring a new associate pastor. And when this associate pastor gets an opportunity to preach, imagine the people being so blown away by the incredible preaching of this new associate pastor. And they start saying amongst each other, wow, we've never heard preaching like this. This guy is so knowledgeable. He preaches with such passion. Okay, this guy preaches with authority that we do not get from the senior pastor. Now, most likely the senior pastor is not around to hear the associate preach, because associates typically preach when the senior pastor is on vacation. But no doubt these whispers and this testimony will get back to the senior pastor. Put yourself in the shoes of the senior pastor. How would you feel? You'd probably feel a little jealous. Maybe you might feel a little threatened by this associate pastor. You might be thinking, well, people are not going to accept my authority. They're going to follow his leadership rather than mine. Let's continue reading here. Jesus, in this same scene, encounters a man who has an unclean spirit, a man who is demon-possessed, And Jesus exercises his authority and commands this unclean spirit to leave. And the demon leaves. The man is healed. Now listen to the reaction here. Verse 27. They were all amazed, so that they debated among themselves, saying, "What is this? A new teaching with authority." He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. Another thing that a reader of Josephus will not be surprised by. Jesus was a man who did wondrous, wonderful works, right? And casting out demons certainly qualifies as that, right? Immediately the news about him spread everywhere into all the surrounding district of Galilee. Jesus is no longer going to be able to continue his teaching and his miracle-working ministry off the radar of the principals. Oh no, he's going to attract their attention. He brings something to the table that they cannot bring themselves, and the people recognize this. When we get to Mark chapter 2, surprise, surprise, here come the scribes. One thing I'll just remind you of is that the religious leaders' primary function in the Gospels is to monitor Jesus' ministry. Doesn't matter whether we're dealing with scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees, or whoever. The primary function of the religious leaders is to monitor Jesus, to make sure that his ministry is consistent with what they believe it should be. Really meaning that Jesus' ministry fits with their interpretation of the Old Testament law, that his ministry fits with the customs that they believe is appropriate for a teacher. So when, in chapter 2, when the scribes show up, Jesus quickly offends them. They believe that Jesus has committed blasphemy because Jesus takes authority that they believe only belongs to God, that authority to forgive someone's sins. Jesus ends up taking that authority and forgives the sins of a paralytic before he actually heals the man. So these scribes are greatly offended. So Jesus has already got one strike against him. As we continue on, Jesus recruits Levi, also known as Matthew, who is a tax collector, to be one of his disciples. And so the Pharisees show up on the scene, the most respected, the most influential of all the religious leaders. And they are offended at Jesus because he is having table fellowship. He is spending time with these tax collectors and, quote, sinners, okay? People that they believe a rabbi, a teacher, a holy man should not be mixing with. So we've got strike number 2. And then later on in the same chapter, on the Sabbath day, Jesus and his disciples are going through a grain field. And the disciples are plucking the heads of the grain off. They're just doing this as a snack. They're not working hard. They're not harvesting or anything like that. But because these Pharisees have such a strict, constrictive view of the Sabbath, even just the smallest act of plucking the heads of the grain off, for them, that is going against what should happen on the Sabbath, that Jesus and his disciples are desecrating the Sabbath. So that's a third strike against Jesus. Now I'm going to go to chapter 3. Chapter 3. This is on the Sabbath, verse 1. He, that is Jesus, entered again into a synagogue, and a man was there whose hand was withered. They, these are the religious leaders, were watching him to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath so that they might accuse him. So they don't have good intentions towards Jesus. They're not fair-minded. They're seeking to trap him so that they can accuse him of profaning the Sabbath day. And that's why they bring in this man with a withered hand, because Jesus has a reputation of healing individuals on the Sabbath.
For these religious leaders, even doing something good, like healing on the Sabbath, is going against the Sabbath, is breaking the Sabbath. Jesus has a different view. Verse 3, and he said to the man with the withered hand, get up and come forward. And he said to them, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath? To save a life or to kill? But they kept silent. After looking around at them with anger, grieved at the hardness of their heart, he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. So this man's withered hand was healed by Jesus in the synagogue on the Sabbath. The Pharisees went out and immediately began conspiring with the Herodians against him as to how they might destroy him. So the Pharisees are willing to be in cahoots with, in league with, a political party that was supportive of King Herod's dynasty. They're willing to get together with these guys, groups that don't fit together, because they want to see Jesus eliminated. There are only 16 chapters in all of Mark, and yet at the very beginning of chapter 3, the religious leaders already have committed in their hearts to destroy Jesus.
I find these accounts of the various reactions to the ministry of Jesus to be credible. And one of the main reasons why I do is because I can relate to the range of emotions and thinking that goes on in response to Jesus' ministry. I mean, hey, I think we can all relate to feeling envious towards an individual who seems to come out of nowhere, who is far more talented than us. And we look at them, and we look at the amount of attention that they're getting and the people that they're winning over. And we think, why can't that be me? And feel jealousy towards that individual. I think all of us can relate towards getting to know someone or reading about an individual who looks at the world far differently than the way that we do. And they conduct themselves in a way that is just seems almost polar opposite of what we do. And we begin to think, well, this person is wrong. And when we look at the amount of people that they're winning over to their side, we begin to see these individuals as a threat. They shouldn't be allowed to say what they're doing, do what they're doing. Now, I'm not saying that Jesus was wrong. Jesus was always right. I'm just saying I can relate to what the Pharisees and the scribes were thinking. The jealousy that the scribes must have been feeling. The threat that both the scribes and the Pharisees saw Jesus, because he was not lining up with their interpretation of doing ministry according to the Old Testament law. These are relatable thoughts and emotions. I haven't even reminded you of all the times in which Jesus went toe-to-toe, publicly debating these religious leaders, and he thrashed them. He silenced them. He debated them based on Scripture. He wasn't afraid to challenge their hypocrisy, to go right after them. Jesus did not show deference to these individuals, and that's something that they expected. We know from reading the Gospels, we know from what Jesus said, hey, these individuals expect to get the best seats at the parties, in the banquets, and Jesus attacked their hypocrisy. He attacked their way of life. Now, Jesus was correct. He was right in doing that. But we also have to understand, that when a person is attacked, They're not going to feel happy about the person who's going after them. These religious leaders were wrong. But one of the things that I do have to point out to you, though, is that these religious leaders, these people with great influence, these people held in high esteem in the community, these people that Josephus refers to as the principals, they actually had the power to do something against Jesus. I'm sure they got tired of being publicly humiliated in debates with him when they would challenge him. They actually had the power to do something about it. And do something they did. I'm going to skip over several chapters. After a sham of a religious trial, Jesus is brought before the Roman ruler, Pontius Pilate, in Mark chapter 15. I'm going to begin reading in verse 1. Early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders and the scribes and the whole Sanhedrin, now these are the principals, immediately held a consultation, and binding Jesus, they led him away and delivered him to Pilate. Pilate questioned him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "It is as you say." The chief priests began to accuse him harshly. Then Pilate questioned him again, saying, "Do you not answer? See how many charges they bring against you?" But Jesus made no further answer. So Pilate was amazed. Now, during the feast of the Passover, Pilate had this practice of releasing to the people a prisoner that they chose. And the crowd reminded him of this custom. I'm going to skip down to verse 9. Pilate answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he was aware that the chief priests had handed him over because of envy. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to ask him to release Barabbas to them instead. Answering again, Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with him whom you call the King of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him!" But Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him!" Wishing to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas for them, and after having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified. So we have principals who are envious of Jesus Christ. They stir up, they manipulate a crowd to get them crying out for Jesus to be crucified. This exerts pressure upon Pontius Pilate, Rome's representative, the one who has the power to condemn Jesus or to save him. But this pressure is so great, he feels the need to satisfy the crowd. He's not a fool. He understands that he has a riot that is about to blow up, that he'll be held responsible for. So instead of caring more about doing what's right, pardoning Jesus, he succumbs to the pressure and consequently hands Jesus over to be crucified. So we can see a matrix of emotions and thoughts and power that consign Jesus to his crucifixion. We can see the events that led up, historically speaking, as to why Jesus was killed. And I think in all of this, there's quite a bit of application. But I'll just point one thing out. I think this is a warning to us to make sure that we are praying for discernment so that we can see what God is doing and support his kingdom purposes. Because we don't want to be like the religious leaders who were convinced that they were doing right, yet were prisoners of their feelings, and ended up becoming adversaries of what the Son of God was up to. God bless you.